I'm Elizabeth Martin, a 45-year-old marketing manager. My life, though busy and sometimes challenging, has always been fulfilling. I work for a well-established company, and despite the occasional high-pressure situation, I find deep satisfaction in my work. My husband, Richard, is a kind man at heart, but his priorities have always been a bit skewed. From the beginning of our marriage, he's shown a peculiar devotion to his sister Eleanor and her daughter Sophie. At first, I tried to be understanding. Family is important, after all. But as years went by, I began to feel more like an outsider in my own marriage. Eleanor, Richard's older sister, has been a constant presence in our lives. She's a single mother to Sophie, a lively teenager. Richard often involves them in our plans, sometimes even prioritizing their needs over ours. I've grown used to the last-minute cancellations of our plans because Eleanor needed something. I remember the early days of our marriage when I tried to voice my concerns. Richard would listen, but his actions never changed. I gradually stopped complaining, realizing it was a battle I couldn't win. In a way, I empathized with Richard's sense of obligation. Eleanor had supported him financially during his college years, a fact he often recounted with a mix of gratitude and guilt. Eleanor's story was no fairy tale either. She married young, but soon found herself in a difficult marriage. Her husband, more interested in his career, wanted her to be a stay-at-home mom. When she finally divorced, her financial situation became strained. Richard stepped in as the supportive brother, something I initially admired. But admiration can slowly morph into resentment when the scales are too unbalanced. Our life together was peaceful, yet I often felt alone. Richard's idea of a weekend well spent involved dining out with Eleanor and Sophie, leaving me behind with my thoughts and a quiet house. The turning point came 3 months ago. Richard approached me one evening with a grave look on his face. "Eleanor's getting a divorce," he said, his voice laced with concern. "She's decided to keep custody of Sophie." I knew Eleanor's marriage was rocky, but the news still caught me off guard. Eleanor, with her sharp tongue and haughty attitude, was difficult for me to be around. I recalled our first meeting at Richard's family home, where she had openly mocked my appearance and taste. No one, not even Richard, had come to my defense. Richard's next words were like a punch to the gut. "I'm going to be spending more time at their place," he announced. "Unlike you, Eleanor is delicate. She needs me." His words stung, but I swallowed my pride and simply nodded. Arguing would only push him further into Eleanor's arms. "Take care," I said, forcing a smile as he left. His absence grew more noticeable. Weekends became a solo affair, and even weekdays were spent alone. I'd return from work to an empty, dark home. The loneliness was suffocating. Then, one day, Richard was unexpectedly at home when I arrived, but the atmosphere was anything but welcoming. "You haven't given Eleanor a housewarming gift yet," he accused. "You're getting a bonus soon, right? Buy her something nice, like a designer bag." I was stunned. "Why should I be the one to give a gift? Why don't you do it, Richard?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He became irate, lecturing me on family values and obligations. The conversation left me emotionally drained and deeply hurt. Richard's family seemed to be his only priority, and I was merely an afterthought. A few days later, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. "You heard from Richard, didn't you?" "It's normal to give a housewarming gift," she said, her tone entitled. I couldn't hold back. "You never gave us a wedding gift," I countered. "Not even a congratulations." Her response was cold. "You're Richard's wife. You're supposed to honor me, not the other way around." Her audacity left me speechless. In all my years with Richard, I had never felt so disrespected. It was a wake-up call. I realized that I deserved better, that I couldn't spend the rest of my life in the shadows of someone else's family. That night, as I lay in bed, a plan began to form in my mind. It was time for a change. It was time for me to step out of the shadows and into the light. As the sun peeked through the blinds the next morning, I felt a new sense of determination. Over breakfast, Richard, oblivious to my inner turmoil, talked about his plans to help Eleanor move into her new apartment. I listened, nodding where appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere. Later that day at work, I couldn't shake off the feeling of discontent. My job, which had always been a source of pride and joy, now felt like the only aspect of my life where I had any control. I wondered how I had allowed myself to become so marginal in my own marriage. That evening, Richard didn't come home. It wasn't unusual anymore. I sat alone in the living room, the TV chattering in the background, providing a semblance of company. I realized that this emptiness had become my norm, a stark contrast to the lively, love-filled home I had once envisioned. Weeks passed in a similar pattern. Richard's visits home became more sporadic, and when he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere. Our conversations, once filled with shared dreams and laughter, were now reduced to logistical exchanges. One day, I returned home earlier than usual to find Richard waiting for me. He had a strange look in his eyes, a mix of guilt and something else I couldn't quite place. "Elizabeth, there's something I need to tell you," he began hesitantly. My heart raced, anticipating more bad news. Eleanor's divorce has taken a toll on her. She's struggling to cope, and I think we should help her more, he said. I felt a sense of déjà vu, another request to put his sister's needs above our own. "What do you mean by help her more?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Richard took a deep breath. "I think Eleanor and Sophie should move in with us for a while. Our house is bigger, and they need the support." I was speechless. The idea of Eleanor and Sophie, with their entitled attitudes, living in our home was unthinkable. Yet I knew arguing would be futile. Richard had made up his mind, and my opinion seemed irrelevant. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of sharing my home with Eleanor and Sophie filled me with dread. It wasn't just about the invasion of my space, it was a symbol of how little my feelings mattered in this marriage. The following week, movers arrived with boxes of Eleanor and Sophie's belongings. I watched as my home transformed into a storage unit for their lives. Each box that entered felt like another piece of my sanctuary being taken away. As the movers left, I sat amidst the clutter, feeling more alone than ever. It was clear that Richard's family would always come first, and I was just a bystander in my own life. It was then that I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed to make a change, for my own sanity and happiness. I had to find the courage to step out of the shadow of Richard's family and reclaim my life. As I pondered my next steps, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't continue living in a home that no longer felt like mine. I needed to find a place where I could be myself, free from the burden of being the unacknowledged partner in my own marriage. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in our house shifted dramatically. Eleanor and Sophie's presence was overwhelming, their personalities and habits encroaching on every aspect of my once peaceful home. Richard seemed more distant than ever, his attention fully consumed by his sister and niece. I started spending more time at work, often staying late to avoid returning to a house that no longer felt like mine. My colleagues noticed the change in my demeanor, but I brushed off their concerns with a smile and a shrug. Inside, I felt a growing sense of despair. One evening, as I finally mustered the courage to return home, I found Richard waiting for me, a stern look on his face. "Elizabeth, we need to talk," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. My heart sank. "What is it, Richard?" I asked, bracing myself for what was to come. "It's about Eleanor and Sophie," he began. "They're going through a tough time, and I think we need to do more to support them." I felt a flash of anger. "More?" I echoed incredulously. "Richard, they've already taken over our home. What more do you expect from me?" He frowned, his patience wearing thin. "I expect you to be a part of this family, Elizabeth. That means supporting each other, no matter what." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My role in this family had been reduced to a mere supporter, an afterthought in my own life. "And what about us, Richard? What about our marriage?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. He avoided my gaze. "This is important to me, Elizabeth. You need to understand that." The conversation went in circles, with Richard refusing to acknowledge my feelings. It was clear that his loyalty lay with Eleanor and Sophie, and I was just an accessory in his life. That night, I lay awake in bed, a mix of emotions churning inside me. I felt betrayed, neglected, and utterly alone. It was a painful realization, but I knew that my marriage as I had known it was over. The next day, I made a decision. I would no longer be a bystander in my own life. I started searching for a new place to live, a haven where I could rebuild my life on my own terms. It wasn't easy. The thought of leaving the home I had built with Richard was daunting, but the prospect of staying in a loveless marriage was far worse. After several weeks of searching, I found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was modest, but it was mine. I signed the lease with a mixture of fear and excitement. I didn't tell Richard about my plans. I knew he wouldn't understand, and I no longer cared to seek his approval. I began packing my belongings in secret, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. The day I moved out, Richard was at work. I left him a note, explaining that I needed space and time to think about our future. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done, but as I closed the door to our house for the last time, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The first few nights in my new apartment were filled with a mix of emotions. The quiet was both unsettling and liberating. I missed the familiarity of my old home, but I relished the freedom of my new space. This small apartment was a blank canvas, a place where I could start painting a new chapter in my life. As I unpacked my belongings, each item evoked a memory, a piece of the life I had shared with Richard. Some brought smiles, others tears. But with each box I emptied, I felt lighter, as if shedding the weight of years of unacknowledged feelings and unmet needs. The following week at work, my colleagues noticed the change in me. "You seem different, Elizabeth," one of them commented. "Lighter, somehow." I smiled, realizing that the decision to leave had not only changed my living situation, but had also started to change me. "I guess I am," I replied. Richard's reaction to my departure was a mix of confusion and frustration. He called several times, leaving messages that ranged from pleading to angry. I listened to each one, my resolve strengthening with his every word. One evening he showed up at my office, unannounced. "Elizabeth, we need to talk," he said, his face a picture of bewilderment and concern. I agreed to talk, but on my terms. We met at a nearby cafe, a neutral space where I felt more in control. "Why did you leave?" Richard asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I needed space, Richard," I replied calmly. "Space to think, to breathe, to be myself." He struggled to understand, his mind still entangled in the obligations to his sister and niece. "But we're a family," he insisted. "You can't just walk away from that." I shook my head. "A family should be a partnership, Richard. It's about mutual respect and understanding. I haven't felt that in a long time." Our conversation circled, with Richard trying to persuade me to return and me standing firm in my decision. It was clear that we were at an impasse, our paths diverging after years of walking side by side. After we parted ways, I walked back to my apartment, feeling a sense of peace. The conversation had confirmed that I had made the right decision. For the first time in years, I was choosing myself, my happiness. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, my new apartment began to feel like home. I decorated it with things that brought me joy, colors that lifted my spirits, and pictures that reflected my journey. I also started to explore new interests, joining a local book club and signing up for a pottery class. These activities brought new people into my life, people who knew me as Elizabeth, not as Richard's wife. I was rediscovering parts of myself that I had long forgotten or neglected. In this newfound freedom, I also found the courage to reflect on my marriage. I acknowledged the good times we had shared, but I also faced the painful truth of how unbalanced it had become. It was a bittersweet realization, but it was essential for my growth. As I lay in bed one night, listening to the soft hum of the city outside my window, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, grateful for the courage to make a change, grateful for the lessons learned, and most of all, grateful for the chance to rediscover myself. The autonomy of living on my own brought a clarity I hadn't realized I was missing. Each day, I grew more comfortable with my decision, feeling more like the protagonist in my life story, rather than a supporting character in someone else's. However, this new chapter was not without its challenges. A couple of months into my solo journey, I received a call that would once again shift the course of my life. It was from a private investigator I had discreetly hired after moving out, prompted by a nagging suspicion about Richard's increasingly odd behavior and absences. The investigator's findings were a harsh blow. Richard had been having an affair. The revelation was both shocking and oddly liberating. It explained so much of his recent behavior, the distance, the preoccupation. The pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was assembling suddenly fell into place. Armed with this information, I confronted Richard. He was stunned, unprepared for my newfound assertiveness and the evidence I presented. His apologies and excuses fell on deaf ears. The betrayal was the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. I initiated the divorce proceedings, a process that was both painful and empowering. The legalities were complex, but I navigated them with a newfound resolve, fueled by the desire to close this chapter of my life. Richard's reaction to the divorce ranged from disbelief to anger, and finally, the revelation of his affair had consequences beyond our marriage. It affected his reputation, his relationships with friends and family, and most significantly, his relationship with Eleanor and Sophie. Eleanor and Sophie's reaction to the news was a mixture of shock and denial. They had placed Richard on a pedestal, and the revelation that he was capable of such deception shattered their image of him. As the divorce finalized, I found myself on the other side of a journey I never expected to take. I was now a single woman, with a past that was a mix of fond memories and painful lessons. But more importantly, I was a woman who had found her voice, her strength, and her independence. The settlement from the divorce, including alimony, was fair but hardly a windfall. It was not about the money, it was about the acknowledgement of my worth and the years I had invested in a marriage that ultimately failed me. Post-divorce, Richard's life took a downturn. His affair had not only cost him his marriage, but also his reputation. The ripple effects were evident in his professional life, and soon he left his job. For me, life after divorce was about rediscovery. I continued exploring new hobbies and interests, building a network of friends who valued me for who I was, not for my marital status or who I was married to. The freedom of this new life was exhilarating. I traveled, I read, I created. I lived on my terms, with no apologies or excuses. The world, once so narrow and confined, now seemed vast and full of possibilities. As I settled into my new normal, I realized that the end of my marriage was not just an ending, but also a beginning of a life where I was the author, where each day was a blank page waiting to be filled with my story, written in my words. Life has a way of testing you, offering lessons wrapped in unexpected envelopes. Just when I thought I had severed all ties with my past, it came knocking on my door in the form of Eleanor and Sophie. I received a message from Sophie, now a young adult, her tone desperate. "Aunt Elizabeth, we need your help. Things have been really tough since you left." I paused upon reading it, a whirlwind of emotions overtaking me. Part of me felt obliged to respond, to offer some assistance, but another part, the part that had fought so hard to establish boundaries and to gain self-respect, resisted. It took some time and self-reflection, but I decided not to reply to Sophie's message. This was their battle to fight, not mine. I had already spent too many years sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of Richard and his family. Eleanor also reached out, her voice laced with the same haughty tone that had always made me bristle. "Elizabeth, we're in a real bind here. I never thought I'd have to ask, but we need financial help." I could hardly believe it. After everything that had transpired, Eleanor still expected me to come to their rescue. It was a stark reminder of the dynamic that had existed in our relationships for all those years. My decision stood firm. "Eleanor, I wish you and Sophie well, but I cannot help you," I said as calmly as I could. There was silence on the line, followed by a string of accusations and insults, reminiscent of so many past conversations. I ended the call and blocked their numbers, severing the last threads of a bond that had brought me little but pain and diminishment. My heart raced with a mixture of guilt and empowerment, signaling the end of an era. At that moment, I knew I had truly turned a page. I felt a complete detachment from the life I once knew, a life where I was unseen and unheard. That night, as I lay in bed, I considered the full weight of the step I had taken. There was a profound sense of finality in my refusal, a clear line drawn between my past and my present. In the silence of my apartment, I pondered the journey that had led me to this point. There was a haunting loneliness in recognizing that I was now entirely on my own, that the family I had once been part of, for better or worse, was now nothing but a part of my history. Yet, with the loneliness came a powerful realization of my strength and independence. I no longer needed the approval or validation of others to feel worthy. I was my own person, standing on my own ground, guided by my own principles and desires. The next morning, I awoke with a newfound sense of peace. I had faced my past head-on, and in doing so, I had found a deeper sense of self. It was a freedom born not just from my new life, but from the recognition of my inner resilience and the courage to uphold my boundaries. The dawn of each new day greeted me with a promise, a whisper of the untold possibilities that lay ahead. My journey, marked by turmoil and triumph, had led me to embrace solitude, not as a burden but as a companion. With each sunrise, I grew more attuned to the rhythms of my own heart, my life now a melody composed of my choices and desires. In the solitude of my new chapter, I sought a friend, a non-judgmental companion to share the quiet moments that bookended my days of self-discovery. The idea of adopting a dog began as a whisper in my mind, a gentle nudge that grew louder with time. One brisk Saturday morning, I walked into the local animal shelter, a sense of mission guiding my steps. The cacophony of barks and whimpers could have been overwhelming, but instead, it felt like a chorus of hope of second chances. My gaze met a pair of soulful brown eyes belonging to a middle-aged beagle mix with an earnest expression. He wagged his tail tentatively, as if unsure of his place in the world, much like I had been. It was a connection that needed no words. I knew he was the one. I named him Max, and together we embarked on the next leg of our journey, both of us seeking love and acceptance in a new beginning. In the company of Max, my home, once a silent space, filled with the soft patter of paws and the comforting presence of another beating heart. Our walks became a meditative ritual, a time to reflect on the path traveled and to revel in the simple joy of being alive, of being free. Looking back, the road I had traveled seemed intricately woven with pain and purpose. I often pondered on the lessons learned, the tears shed, and the laughter echoed in the corridors of time. Above all, I had learned the paramount importance of self-care and independence, the foundations upon which my new life was built. Freedom had been a costly pursuit, both emotionally and financially, but its rewards were immeasurable. I no longer saw myself through the lens of others, but rather through my own understanding of who I was and who I wanted to be. Some nights, Max and I would sit by the window, watching the stars twinkle in the vast canvas of the sky. In those moments of quiet companionship, I realized that while the future was unwritten, I approached it not with trepidation, but with curiosity and a sense of adventure. I had indeed come a long way, from the unacknowledged partner to a woman of resilience and substance. My journey bore witness to the metamorphosis of a soul from the shackles of neglect to the wings of autonomy. As I pen down these final words, the chapter of my rebirth draws to a close. Yet, the story of Elizabeth Martin is far from over. With Max by my side and a heart open to life's infinite tapestry, I step forward, a weaver of my own destiny.